Welcome to Lawgical, the UAE's first and still the only regular legal podcast. My name's Tim Elliott. I'm with the managing partner of the Dubai-based legal firm, HPL Yamalova and Pleska, at their offices in JLT, Jumeirah Lakes Towers here in Dubai. And here's Ludmila Yamalova. Nice to see you.
Good to be here, Tim, with you as always, and thanks for being here.
You're always welcome. This time on Lawgical, D&O Insurance, Directors and Officers Insurance. Two questions to start with, Ludmila. What is it and who benefits from insurance like this?
What is it? As you rightfully said, it's directors and officers insurance, hence D&O Insurance. Who would benefit from it? Many, and in particular with regards to the UAE, practically every company, for the most part, would benefit from it, and in particular, its senior employees and directors. So what is D&O Insurance kind of at a high level? And surprisingly enough, by the way, as I raise this question, and perhaps this is the reason why we're having this podcast, is because it's still to this day in the UAE, D&O Insurance is very rare and is highly uncommon. And in most cases, when I bring it up with a lot of our clients, it's always met with much surprise and a bit of a glare. And just like you had to look up what D&O Insurance stands for. So I get very much the same reaction from a lot of the clients who I bring it up to, although these are the very people who should have been covered by D&O Insurance for many years. Now, let's kind of parse into it or dive into it. So ultimately, at a high level, what is it? What is it? Insurance. It's a type of insurance. It's a type of insurance coverage, a policy, and we all know what insurance more or less stands for. And there's health insurance, there's travel insurance, there is medical insurance and or medical liability or indemnity insurance and so on and so forth. And there's property insurance and there is what's called the D&O insurance. So it's a type of policy that covers certain category of employees and senior executives and managers at the company level. So it's a coverage for company employees of a certain level and certain responsibilities. And this, by the way, and we can talk about it a little later in terms of the comparison between the D&O insurance and the professional indemnity insurance, because these are two separate types of insurances. And in most cases, those who are based in the UAE are not only aware of the professional indemnity insurance, but many of them actually have it as part of the requirement of being able to operate in the UAE. But D&O insurance is not a requirement. So let me first talk about the D&O, and then we can kind of contrast it with the indemnity insurance, the professional indemnity insurance. So what is it? It's basically an insurance policy or an insurance plan that will provide financial assistance to fund a defense case or defense costs for directors or senior management against any potential liability from a claim that could have been brought by a number of people that would have potentially had interest in the dealings of that particular company. And these, at least theoretically, some of these actions would have happened as a result of these directors and officers' actions or inactions. So let me be more specific. Give a specific example. So, for example, a company gets sued by a client because they failed to provide a certain kind of certain advice. So it's less about, for example, the specific service that was provided, but perhaps the inadequacy, inappropriateness of that particular service, right? So it's less about, well, I hired you to do this and you didn't do it very well. It's rather that you told me to do this, but in fact it was a wrong decision, it was a wrong advice, or it was implemented wrongly. It could be by a client, it could be by consumers as well, it could be by employees. So the claim could be also by shareholders and regulators. And there's loads and loads of examples kind of throughout in the West in particular, but as well, for example, the company gets fined. Perhaps an example that's more specific and closer to home for us in the UAE. Let's say immigration officers come to an office to inspect company's employees, and they find out that there's 2 or 3 employees that are working in the company without proper visas, right? Well, that's a violation in the UAE, and each one of them carries 50,000 dirham penalty. And that's to the company. In addition, it also carries a penalty for the employees themselves who are being employed illegally. So now, whose decision was this? It was a decision, obviously, of the manager of the company or somebody senior. Let's say the manager or the officers, the directors of the company wanted to challenge those fines because those fines, let's say, they were not justified, or there was reasons against, or explanations as to why those people were there at the time that they were being inspected. Often, by the way, as part of the fines, there are fines to the company, and also there could be fines to the manager. And previously, these fines with the manager, and I'll tell you, I've seen this in real time. So if there were especially repeated fines, or sometimes if there were too many employees working illegally when the inspectors would come, the manager would be personally liable. And so the manager would be taken to the police station, and then ultimately there'll be potentially some sanctions, and if not, criminal cases filed against the manager. So these are just some examples of incidents that could happen and do often happen. And there are many more, and we can kind of walk through those shortly. But in the meantime, so let's say if that were to happen, I guess let me give you another example. Let's say another example where the company, there's the senior management of the company are at the request of the shareholders, for example, made certain financial decisions with regards to managing companies' funds. And then at some point in time, one of the employees resigns, or the company decides to terminate employees. And again, the management has to sign off on this. And as part of these employee termination cases, there's a number of claims that come forward in terms of end-of-service benefits. And in some cases, end-of-service benefits could go up to $1 million dirhams per person. Let's say you have 5 or 10 people like this resigning, or they being terminated, and all of a sudden the company is being approached with a claim for, let's say, 10 million dirhams that they have to pay as part of the service, which they had not budgeted for and they had not planned for. Or they might have planned for, but the senior management had, at the request of the shareholders, for example, transferred that money from the company's books for other purposes, or they spent it differently. For other purposes, and did not accrue that money, or did not budget for these kinds of end of services payments or requests, and perhaps it was in the books but not in their accounts. So here they are with, okay, we got a claim for 10 million dirhams to be paid as end of service, but the company doesn't have that kind of money. Well, now why does it not have that kind of money? Well, because let's say there were some financial decisions that were made that the company had transferred this money bought something else, let's say bought a property, or made some other kind of investments, or paid some other customers, or bought some expensive services, for example, right? And then the questions would come up, well, who authorized this? And the management can say, well, our shareholders requested for us to transfer this money away. So, but in the meantime, by virtue of how proceedings normally happen, it's who is responsible first. It's not the shareholders. It's basically the company, whoever represents the company, and that's usually the manager on the license. It could be the HR person, the HR manager. It could be the directors of the company, and so on and so forth, not the shareholders, right? So now these directors and managers and officers find themselves on the defensive, where they need to represent themselves in court, be it criminal court or civil court, or other even employment cases, where they have to defend not just the company but also sometimes themselves. So, but how do you do it? With what money do you do that? Because not only are you now having to file your own court case or hire your own lawyers and pay money to the lawyers, to the court, to the translators, but also you're taking your time to try to defend yourself. And that's not to mention that potentially your job security is in question in the meantime. And there are many, many, many cases like this. What the D&O Insurance does is that it allows that particular person to tap into their insurance. This is called D&O Insurance, where the insurance company will pay for those legal costs. So will pay for those defense costs. And the coverage can come in two different ways. In one, it can just come in terms of, okay, here you have X amount of money that is being paid, that is being allocated as per your plan for these kinds of proceedings, for example. And so you spend that money on your own, or we'll advance this money and you kind of litigate on your own. That's one way. The other way is that, well, there's X amount of money that's allocated, and we will appoint or we will manage lawyers that will defend this particular case. So ultimately, what ends up happening is that you're protecting your senior management that represents the company, that makes decisions on behalf of the company, and a lot of the times these decisions are, by the way, are being made in good faith. Or upon representation of many other senior staff or senior representatives at the request of the senior management as shareholders, and so on and so forth. And so now you're being held accountable to basically be for acting on the instructions of somebody that's either more senior or somebody that's more influential for making those decisions. So you made them in good faith, or because that was sort of the protocol for you to do this if your senior management or shareholders ask you to do that. So what can you do? And not only can you lose the job, but you're now stuck in these defending yourself in these proceedings. So that's what this insurance is for, is to basically protect all that senior management. And in the UAE, specifically, it'd be the managers are listed on the trade license, because by de facto, they have the default authority to represent the company and therefore make decisions on behalf of the company. Therefore, whenever there is a claim, by default, they are the first ones to be held accountable. Now in court, they can prove otherwise, but in terms of representation, they will be the first line of defense. So it would be the managers, it'd be the directors when you have the board of directors, and it also could be shareholders as well. But usually it's just senior management. So you see the utility or the benefit of this particular coverage. Yet there's very little of this kind of insurance that we see in the UAE business community. So it's still a very novel concept, and most of the time people don't even really, not just think about it, they don't even know about it. And I have to tell you, it's interesting because there's so many people here with very highfalutin titles, and they love the title of CEO, the CFO, the chairman, and they're very happy to take on those senior titles, not just on their business cards and their let's say in their email signatures, but also on official documents such as license, for example, or memorandum of associations or articles of incorporation. So because it makes them feel very important, influential, and that's all good and understandable, except that when the hammer comes down, it will be those people who will be the first ones to be held accountable. And so that's why it's so important for all those who are being put in those positions to know that there's always a liability of being brought accountable for the acts, not just even their own acts, but also the acts of the company. Or the acts of others in the company. And so therefore they need to be mindful that they should, in the very least, have this insurance in addition to whatever other contractual obligations and benefits the company might, for example, offer to them as part of their job.
So this is clearly not very common at all here, which is a surprise, but it's distinctly different from other types of workplace business insurances, professional liability insurance, for example.
Yes, because professional liability refers to your own profession, right? So, for example, let's say I do run a law firm and I am a lawyer. So that is my profession. Profession is a lawyer, and as a lawyer, I have my own liability insurance. That's my professional indemnity insurance, and that pertains more to the person that provides that exercises or conducts that particular profession.
Right.
So, for example, lawyers would have professional indemnity insurance, and that usually happens when lawyers, for example, give wrong advice, or they lose documents, or some kind of case of negligence, exercise a case of negligence. But that pertains to usually that specific person exercising that specific profession. And so, or for example, it could extend also to the office of the lawyers, right? So like a law firm, to other lawyers as well. So you could have your own personal liability insurance as a lawyer, but also the law firm can have its own professional liability insurance or indemnity insurance. But it usually refers to the profession and basically the choices and the decision made by those professionals exercising their particular trade in that industry. Whereas for D&O insurance, it's just senior management of whatever business. And by the way, not all professional indemnity insurance is applicable or available to any kind of business, because you basically need to exercise it as a profession. So who is a profession? Well, what is a profession in this particular case? It would be lawyers, doctors, accountants, for example, auditors, certain kinds of engineers. But what if you just have a trading business? What profession is that? There is no professional liability insurance necessarily that exists for trading businesses, or for example, for a restaurant, or for a web designer. You see, so a company or any other kind of consultancy, just general consultancy company. So there isn't like a professional insurance that exists in that particular field of business. So that's why professional liability insurance and professional indemnity insurance, otherwise known, it's only available in certain kinds of professions, certain kind of industries, and only to certain kinds of individuals practicing that trade. Whereas a D&O insurance, it's basically to senior management anywhere. So by the way, also let's say at a law firm, you could also have, as a lawyer, I would have my own professional indemnity insurance, but I could also have a D&O insurance, because certain examples or certain decisions at the firm are made by not lawyers, so they will not be covered by this. But let's say the chief financial officers, right? They're not lawyers, so for them to be covered by lawyer insurance, that would not qualify, but they could be covered by a D&O insurance because they're acting as an officer of the company or of the law firm. Or let's say you have even an HR manager, again, who makes decisions on behalf of the law firm. I'm using a law firm just as an example. Could be an accounting firm, could be a medical facility, but they're making these decisions with regards to employees as a manager of that particular company or business. And then they're sued by that employee, for example, for some kind of discrimination tactics or discrimination claims, or for non-payment of this claim or that claim. And they could often bring in a particular employee into the case. And so those employees in these cases would not be covered by professional indemnity insurance, but they would be covered by a D&O insurance. That's the general kind of example or difference between the two types of insurance. And in the UAE, and I have seen this, by the way, the space evolve. When I started practicing 15 years ago, professional indemnity insurance was not really talked about very much, but as time went on, it became a requirement. And in most businesses these days or professions, there's a requirement. So for you every year to renew your license, you need to renew your professional indemnity insurance, for example. And that applies to a lot of businesses. Whereas the D&O insurance, I have yet to see a single place or a single company or business that actually has it as a requirement. But additionally, so even a lot of the international companies that operate in the UAE, who perhaps in their own home jurisdictions in other countries would offer this kind of insurance to their employees, in those jurisdictions do not offer that kind of coverage to their employees here. And we've seen a lot of cases where employees have to kind of fend for themselves. Sometimes the company will foot the bill, other times it won't. Often cases like this, when the person is being sued, the company tries to separate itself so that the person is really left alone to fend for themselves.
Okay. And is that purely because it's a cost to the company? Or?
Interestingly enough, well, it doesn't have to be the cost. If you have proper D&O insurance on an ongoing basis, it's a sort of manageable cost, right? So, but when there is a dispute, obviously that it becomes a serious cost and a liability for the company as well, in terms of even being held accountable for acts that may lead, in addition to costs, or other types of sanctions. So, such as, for example, freezing of the license, or closing of the business, or even criminal sanctions, right? In those cases, companies often try to say, oh, well, we didn't do it. That particular employee didn't have the authority to do this and that, for example. It's your cost is definitely one, but perhaps I would say the main reason that why we don't see insurance much here in the UAE is because it's just not a topic that has really been talked about very much, or is not promoted or marketed much by insurance companies, and I guess it is in a way. Businesses in the UAE and the whole business community in the UAE has developed so rapidly that often companies are sort of catching up with the kind of more modern and more kind of up-to-date practices after the fact. So it may be that in the next few years, as more businesses become more professional and more solid, that this topic will become more of not so much of a topic, but the concept of insurance becomes more of a standard practice, just as the professional indemnity and professional liability insurance has become now. But for the time being, I think obviously businesses, when they start out, they try to minimize their costs. And insurance, it's not a direct kind of benefit. You don't see the direct benefit of it. Obviously, in most businesses, when they start up, they don't foresee troubles in the future. They will only pay for the expenses that are mandatory, such as the professional indemnity insurance, but not necessarily for any other kind of costs, especially the ones that don't directly benefit the business, but rather a particular individual in the business.
I think that's kind of prevailing attitude here, isn't it, as well? I think there's an attitude to insurance. Clearly, there's an opportunity here. I had to look D&O up. I have to come clean about that. I didn't know about it, but there's clearly good reason for it. But if you look, let's take a simple example of home insurance, home contents insurance. It's pretty scarce. It's scarce. If you looked at the number of people here who have home contents insurance versus other countries, I think there wouldn't be really very much balance between the two, let's be honest. So I think, maybe take that into account as well. It's something that clearly could grow.
Absolutely. And if my memory serves me right, a few years back, you and I might have done a podcast on home insurance, or rather lack or absence of home insurance coverage in the UAE as a practice.
Yeah.
So you're right. It's a very good analogous example or analogy to the D&O insurance, something so ubiquitous and that applies to so many of us here, because the home insurance or content insurance, it doesn't just apply to those who own real estate, but also those who rent. So that's content insurance. And so it applies really to basically all of us here. And yet it is so rare that people don't even really think about. And that's another example of something that an area that still is ripe to develop further. And so D&O insurance is just another example of that. But I think it's important now, and we're seeing, and that perhaps the topic has come up a little more now in particular, and why I think it's important to highlight it at this point in time is because the UAE as a jurisdiction, as a legal system, as a business community continues to evolve very rapidly. And as part of it, there's a lot of new legislation that are being introduced. And so now companies are required to not only understand and sort of know these regulations and keep up with all that information, but also implement those regulations. So that's one example, VAT. Another example, and we've talked about it, we've done a podcast on this, is corporate tax that's coming. Then you have the anti-money laundering regulations. Then you have all sorts of banking regulations. And then there is the ESR, or the economic substance requirement regulations, and so on and so forth. And so therefore, as a company, there's always this kind of ongoing and in a way, almost like a moving target obligation in terms of, okay, what are the obligations next year? What are my obligations as a company? Well, now I have the ESR, the economic substance requirements, regulations. I have the AML, the anti-money laundering regulations to follow, and so on and so forth. So if the company doesn't do it, who's responsible? Right? And so as a manager of the company, as directors of the company, or as a senior decision makers for the company, if for example they haven't taken the time to learn and understand these regulations, let alone implement them into their day-to-day workings, and then the company gets fined. What happens? Or even perhaps more seriously, and this happens all too often, with the managers of the company, the senior management understand, because they're the boots on the ground, they understand what needs to be done and how their business needs to evolve now because of all these new regulations. But the shareholders, the kind of decision makers in the back, who have been used to things or business being running the way it had been running all these years, for example, without having to pay taxes, without having to account for all the different anti-money or laundering regulations or this economic substance requirements and so on and so forth. The shareholders, for example, the decision makers, are kind of still resistant and reluctant to embrace these new changes, which in most cases result in additional costs, and additional protocols, and in additional compliance efforts. And so they're resistant. So the manager's saying, we should do our books differently now. But the shareholder's saying, well, we can kind of carry on a little longer. Or the management can say, well, we need, for example, to report or do the bookkeeping or do audits in such way. And let's say the UBOs, the ultimate beneficiaries, may say, well, not necessarily, don't worry about it, for example, right? And then the company gets slammed with sanctions and fines and threats of closing the business. And that's not to mention the individual liability of some of the directors and managers that may be held to account, or for many other regulators or employees. So I mean, this happens all too often. So this is why, I guess, my advice to all those who are listening to this podcast and who are holding senior management positions, that they that at least as part of their as their employment terms and conditions and negotiation, they should always negotiate as part of their compensation to have D&O insurance. So I would say, if it were me, and I'm just, I guess, and I'm a good example, if I were offered a senior position, I would perhaps take a bit of a haircut on the salary. But in exchange that I have ongoing D&O insurance, because if I were required or hired to act in one of these sort of senior positions, so that is, and this is why, and we've seen a number of recent cases where clients have come and they're setting up big businesses for their companies here in the UAE, be it in the DIFC on the mainland or any of the free zone. It could be holding companies, could be trust funds, could be branches of businesses, could be brand new businesses, and so on and so forth. And they usually send people here to set up the businesses and put them as senior management. Well, as I'm counseling our clients through this process, I always highlight the importance, especially when you're coming into a new country, that in the very least, as part of your compensation, you should definitely ensure that you have this D&O insurance. It's a small cost to pay for a company. It's just that it's an actual benefit to the employee, and that's why it should perhaps come from the employees to advocate for themselves and to insist that they have that sort of coverage. Or otherwise just, take a lesser important role, but, higher compensation, but don't take the responsibility or the title of responsibility.
I had no idea walking in today about D&O insurance, but I have learned something. So it is available here. It's not a great cost to a company, but it could be of huge benefit to both the employee involved and, I guess, also the company, depending on how benevolent they are.
Absolutely. And by the way, to your point about it is available. There are insurance companies that offer this service because it's not a very common service. They won't necessarily by default kind of sell you this package or come knocking on your door and offer it to you, but it is available. And it depends on when you go through if you decide to go through the process, make sure that you understand the coverage in terms of the amounts and also the coverage in terms of the geography. Because, yes.
I was going to ask that. Does it extend... If you're, I don't know, if you're a regional base in Dubai, does it extend to, I don't know, Riyadh or to Pakistan or, other geographical locations?
There are different types of insurance, but in short, yes, there are those policies. Those policies with that kind of coverage are available. You just need to make sure that you request a more extensive coverage because let's say you could be overseas, you could be based in Dubai, you could be overseeing operations that, as you rightfully said, would extend to Saudi Arabia or Pakistan or South Africa or what have you, or Europe. So if you want the broader coverage, make sure that you have that coverage. I will tell you there's an interesting nuance. And we see it over and over again that a lot of these insurance, they will offer you either local coverage or even the global coverage, but there's almost always an exclusion for the U.S. The U.S. is almost always excluded from this kind of coverage, and obviously it's because of the cost in the U.S. is typically known as being sort of a very litigious society, and the legal fees and the legal cases in the U.S. can really skyrocket very quickly. So that's why a lot of the insurance policies actually specifically exclude the U.S. So if you find yourself in one of those situations, just make sure that if you do a lot of work that may involve the U.S. or may bring a case in the U.S., you definitely want to have this D&O insurance. I'll give you another example. So that's one. So geography is one. The other one is the amount of money, right? So there's some insurance that will offer you, let's say, 1 million dirhams. Others are 3 million or 5 million dirhams up to. So in other words, they will cover your cost up to a certain amount. So just whenever you go through the process, you want to make sure that you understand that as well and kind of gauge your potential risks. And how do you gauge your risks? It's on the basis of the type of claims you may potentially foresee. And I'll tell you, so back in the old days, in my younger years, I used to be an associate general counsel for a publicly traded company in the U.S. And a cyber office company. And at that time, when I was practicing, there was a very kind of common thread of litigation, which was called a shareholders derivative litigation or a shareholder derivative suits. So where the shareholders were suing, because we were a publicly traded company. So this happens with publicly traded companies where shareholders sue the company, right? And when the shareholders sue the company, and this perhaps is one of the best example of showing how D&O insurance is important. When the shareholders sue the company, who do they sue in the company? So you don't just sue the company, right? There is the company, then there is the shareholders of the company, then there's the employees of the company, then there's the senior employees of the company, and then there's the management of the company, and then there's the board of directors, right? And so let's say if you just look in general, the high level, kind of in very simple terms, is the board of directors that is deemed to be the decision makers for the company, right? But there's also the CEO, which usually is part of the board of directors. But anyway, so when you file a case, when the shareholder files a case against the company, it's called the shareholders derivative suit, then they sue the board. But the board is a compilation of several individuals. So each one of those individuals is also basically can be personal liable. So therefore, the D&O insurance kicks in at different levels. It kicks in on behalf of the company. So right, but also at that point, the company's interest and the director's interest may actually be at odds. Right, because the company and the directors and each one of the directors are at odds. So therefore, each one of the directors has his or her own D&O insurance. You see, directors and officers insurance. So that's why, and then the company is paying. In the meantime, for this insurance plan, right? And so when something like this happens, the company basically has its own fund to fight the shareholders' derivative suits as a company, but also each one of the directors has its own funding and its own counsel to represent them as part of this case. So that's one interesting example and a very typical example. And then when I was practicing in the Silicon Valley, that was the era of shareholder derivative suits. And that was the case where, in particular, we saw this D&O insurance kick in every single time. And it was really, really not handy. It was just necessary, especially. And that's why in the West, it's a very common type of insurance. And almost nobody will take a senior position or decision-making position, in particular in publicly traded companies, without this kind of coverage.
It's interesting that you say it was necessary. I mean, Silicon Valley, you can understand immediately why that's necessary. I'd go as far as to say, Isn't essential a better word?
Absolutely. Absolutely essential, imperative, critical.
So, quite right. So your advice to professionals here in the UAE, if you're thinking of taking on a senior professional position, D&O Insurance should be contractually based.
For sure. And as we all know, those who practice in the UAE for a long time in business, there's a lot of companies here that are set up that are perhaps not so much shell companies, but they're companies that are often, they have sort of either nominal shareholders and nominal directors, or so not sort of super active directors or officers, and they're just basically holding interests for different in institutions or different UBOs, as they're called, ultimate beneficial owners. And historically, I've seen here a lot of people who ultimately have taken those positions, who held these kinds of officer and director positions because it was financially kind of a lucrative arrangement, but they were not really sort of involved in the day-to-day decision-making cases or decision-making. And then when the case is brought against the company, all of a sudden, whoa, their heads start rolling. And so in those cases in particular, whenever anybody is being appointed to any one of the senior roles, especially official senior roles, such as being on the board or on the license, and especially in cases where those people are not the decision makers, the day-to-day decision makers, but somebody else is making decisions, but yet officially they are the ones that are representing the company. So in those cases in particular, they must, as you rightfully said, contractually agree to having that kind of insurance as part of the compensation package.
That's another edition of Lawgical, this time D&O, Directors and Officers Insurance. As ever, thank you for watching or listening or both. And thanks to our legal expert, managing partner here at Yamalova and Pleska, Ludmila Yamalova. As always, thank you for your expertise.
It's always a pleasure, Tim.
Find us at LY Law, social media, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn. We are pretty much everywhere these days. You can find all our podcasts at lylawyers.com or at your favorite podcast platform. If you'd like a legal question to be answered in an episode of Lawgical, or to talk to a qualified UAE experienced legal professional, that's simple. Click the contact button at lylawyers.com.